What's up everyone? Lance Hedrick here, and today I've got something spicy for you. Now before we get into this video, I feel like I'm gonna make a disclaimer. Whatever the results of this test are that I'm about to present to you, they are not some sort of encouragement to go out and buy something. This is more so trying to understand the dynamics of extraction. And I think that this is a pretty interesting result that I've stumbled upon. Now, I'm also not saying that this is the only way, and I'm also not saying that people can't have different interpretations of what this might be, but it's very interesting, and I'm very excited to show it to you because it's something I've been wondering about for a long time, and I finally have a way to actually test it. I look at, essentially, depth of puck versus diameter of puck. I was able to look into this because Swerks released somewhat recently this step-down basket, which is 58mm compatible on top, but it goes down to a 49mm basket. And then I also have the 58mm basket from Swerks. So I've wanted to compare deeper pucks with smaller diameters to wider pucks with bigger diameters for a long time, but that would necessitate using two different machines, which just brings in a ton of variables. Now, this isn't to say that using this basket is going to negate all potential variables that could cause inconsistency, but I think this is the most controlled I am able to do an experiment on this with direct comparisons possible. We've used 58mm baskets for I don't know how long, and over time, because it's what's used in commercial shops, people just assume it must a priori be a better option. So people want to move up from their 54mm machines they start with to a 58, or people aren't satisfied with their small lever and they want to go to a big semi-automatic. Whatever the question is or whatever the issue is, they want to move up bigger. I've been talking to some machine manufacturers who have incredible smaller diameter machines, but they're looking to increase to 58 because that's popular demand. Now, I have not been a fan of that increase ever, for the most part. I've always been a fan of much deeper pucks. In fact, I was preaching years ago that people need to get, 26, 27 gram VST baskets in order to have a deeper puck where you can grind a lot coarser and you get a better shot. But I never really had anything to prove that other than anecdote. And on top of that, that's a ton of coffee to go through for a shot of espresso, especially in a cafe. Which leads me to an interesting trend that I witnessed in specialty coffee shops over the past 5 or so years, maybe even longer, which is a move from the traditional kind of 20 gram dose that people were typically doing in cafes down to 16 to 17 gram doses. Now the idea here is people were saying they could get better shots by using smaller baskets, thinner baskets, and making the puck smaller. But in reality, it was a way to save money. 4 grams less on a shot for every shot, if you're pulling hundreds a day, is a massive amount of coffee that you save. When you also take into account your dial-in shots, you get to save 4 grams, which is a big hunk of that. It's 20% of that full dose. Like, that's a big save on costs. And I would sit and try and dial in these smaller, thinner pucks and never really enjoyed it. And I always opted for bigger doses, 22 gram baskets, 22 gram pucks, 21 gram pucks, whatever it might be, in order to make the coffee taste better. And then when I started to play around with these Los San Marco groups, like on the ACS Fostic, on the Nuri, where they're 54, 55 millimeters, I was getting much better coffee, but was thinking, well, maybe it's just the lever effect. Then when I would play with like a Barista Express from Breville versus the Breville Dual Boiler, I was noticing I could get incredible espresso with that smaller diameter, with a much wider margin of error. But then the thing that kind of pushed me over the top started when I got a Cremina, and then a La Pavoni, and then a Streetman. Those are 51, 51, 49mm portafilters, respectively. Once I got into these older levers where they were smaller diameters, I really started noticing this incredibly increased quality of espresso with a lot wider margin of error, where essentially it was difficult to pull bad shots, even with less than ideal grinders. Anybody can argue with anecdotal evidence, and we just go into a circle. Well, I've tasted all of these at 58, and they're so much better than my 49. You could just be dialing in differently. Also, it could be a psychological thing or whatever it might be. But anyway, all of those experiences led me to wanting to actually test, what that is all about. I was recently having a conversation with a friend about this idea of aspect ratio and how I believe that it's not necessarily the diameter, the smaller diameter, that is allowing a better cup, but it is the aspect ratio in conjunction or compared to the wider, more shallow puck. So for instance, in a 49 millimeter puck, if we have a 26 millimeter bed depth, then in a 58 millimeter puck, in order to match that aspect ratio, we would need like a 31 millimeter depth, which would be like a 30 gram basket. In these more narrow baskets, we're able to grind quite a bit coarser while still maintaining that pressure and getting a nice extraction. There have been lots of misunderstandings in the past when I do extraction tests. People think I'm trying to say that higher extraction equals better. No, what I'm seeing is consistency, I'm seeing efficacy of extraction, I'm seeing evenness of extraction, and there's a very clear trend that happens in this experiment. So I took two different coffees. I took a washed Kenya and I took a washed Colombia, both roasted by Onyx Coffee Lab. And I dialed them both in to the same recipe with the same dose, everything the same as much as possible. Obviously the grind size would be different, but I wanted them to have the same ratio. So 20 grams in, 60 grams out, and I aimed for about 30 seconds. This has a lot more headspace, the step down basket with 49 bottom. So what I did is I ground up 20 grams of coffee in each, tamped it down. I took one of those thin billet screens like this, and I placed it on top of both just to hamper water from flowing through too quickly. I would put it on, and then I would measure the headspace by volume using a kettle of water and a scale. I took that amount of water and I tried to figure out what flow rate I needed over about 6 seconds in order for them both to have full head spaces before starting kind of the full infusion or the full extraction. And then I aimed to get them both peaking at 9 bar at around the 10-second mark. That way I could have as similar of an extraction as possible as far as the water going through the puck, fresh water, etc. goes. On my EG1, which I used for the experiment, I used core burrs and I did a 2.0 grind size for the 58 millimeter, and I did a 2.7 for the 49 with the Colombia coffee. Now that is about 35 microns of burr movement, which is a big difference between the two. On the same coffee, if you were to move 7 steps, that would change the shot from a 20-second shot to like an 80-second shot or something. So essentially the difference here is I did this one at about as high of a flow rate as possible on the descent, which read about 10 milliliters a second. I'm not sure what it actually is, of course, because there's no way of objectively knowing that with the algorithm built in. And then this one was closer to about 3.3 or 3.4 grams a second, just for the first 6 seconds. This was faster so that it could fill that headspace. This was slower because there's a lot less headspace. And then at about that 6-second mark, I just let it go to whatever flow rate it needed to get to 9 bar, and they both peaked at about 10 seconds for the shots. Because this is a much wider puck, more surface area, the top layer has more grounds exposed. There's gonna be a little bit more of a wetted puck here than in this one, although this one does have a faster flow rate, so maybe it penetrates a bit deep. So who knows how much of the bed is actually being wetted before the pressure kicks in, but that is as close as I could get, and I still think that the results are incredibly valid when you look at them, because you'll see what I mean when we get there. Well, what I expected is this to taste sweeter and less harsh because, like I said, I believe deeper baskets give you a better extraction. I thought it would have a lower extraction, though, because I knew I'd have to grind quite a bit coarser with this basket than with this. With the 58 millimeter, it's a much wider surface area on the bottom. It's going to be you're going to have to grind a lot finer, and it's going to have a lot more open solubles. It's going to go through much quicker and likely more even in my mind because it's a more shallow puck. And in my head, a more shallow puck should give you more even extraction. Whereas a deeper puck, you might have more stratified extraction from top to bottom. Even though it is coarser though, and we know from turbo shots that coarser grounds are better. But also we know from logic, the finer you go, the more, concretized it is, the harder it is for water to get through. Even with that much coarser grind size inside the deep basket, we had about the same, if not a little higher, extraction yield. Which doesn't make any sense. If you say that this has a more even extraction because it's a more shallow puck, if the 58 millimeter has a more even extraction, then you would see a higher extraction yield. But instead we see the same with finer grinds, which should promote higher extractions, and with the fact that it has, these are high extraction baskets, which is something I should note. This is a Swarks 58 with the standard flow. This is Swarks step down. Both holes to the edge, wide surface area, should give us really high extractions, which is why they're between 24 and 25%. Blew my mind. And so it makes sense deductively that this is promoting a much more even extraction through the puck and with coarser grounds. Now, I always tell people they should always go coarser in any coffee brew method you have. Always go coarser than finer. The finer you get, the more stringent particles you're going to have free floating. The finer you go, the worse the flow rate through the actual puck. So going coarser and then going finer to taste is what I always recommend. So not only are the numbers kind of mind-blowing with how high this extracted, even though it's a deeper puck with coarser particles, it was also what you would expect in blind tasting. This consistently tasted way better than the 58 millimeter. Now, the main note I had on these 58 millimeter tastes with both the Kenya and the Columbia was that most of them bordered on astringent. They were more bitter, they were a bit wispier, they had a little less body. Even though you would think that, finer grounds would let more of the particles through, which can bolster the body, but the texture of this, the body, the feeling of it was better, which is a little wild if you think about it, because we also know through a lot of history that the bigger the headspace, the worse the texture. You want those grounds as close to where the water's coming out as possible. You don't want that water head over it. But this one, even with 60 grams of a head of water, still had a better texture. Now, neither of them were like thick and gooey because I was using a pretty lightly roasted coffee, but the texture of this one, the mouthfeel and everything, was superior in the 49 millimeter. So that also kind of contributes or aids to the idea that it's a more even extraction coming out of the 49. The 58 millimeter basket began to decline in pressure at about 35 grams out. And that's because the coffee was much more finely ground, so it peaked a little faster and then it would decrease really quickly, has a wider surface area and a more shallow puck. But it also might be that there's a lot more channels forming. Now that's completely speculative, but when you look at the fact that this was so much more finely ground and a thinner puck, you would expect the extraction yield to be a bit higher. And the fact that it was a little less makes you think, well, maybe it was those channels that was kind of quickening up the pace of that shot. And so you will see a decrease in the pressure near the end, whereas with the 49 step down, you don't see that decrease. When you have a deeper puck, you're also going to have a better filtration system going on. So the puck is like the most efficient way of filtering. It's incredibly efficient. And so you're likely getting less of those astringent particles through the bed, even if they're equal between the two. A shallow puck, it's going to be able to travel through a lot more easily, even if the grounds are more finely ground up. Whenever I was doing these tastings, I got a lot less astringency. I was getting almost no bitterness in the shots with the 49 millimeter. Now, when I say the texture was better, I'm not saying it was like this thick, syrupy thing. It was just the mouthfeel was much more preferable. It wasn't as rough. It wasn't as harsh. With the 58, though the shots themselves, if I were to taste it alone, I'd be like, that's a good shot. But once I put it side by side with these, they tasted a bit better. And it's funny that this has somewhat been known in Italy for a while. This is why those La San Marco groups, when I get the Vostok, it comes stock with a triple shot basket, a really deep basket where you have to put like 25 grams in on a 54 millimeter. Where's the happy tamper? So you can see some of my methodology, what I did, and it's all written up in the document down below. Just scroll to the bottom of the page. There you have my methodology. But essentially, I would take my portafilter. I would have it on a Pixis scale. I'm not using it in the video because I don't need extreme granularity here for an example. But the Pixis scale goes down to 0.05 resolution. And so I used that in order to ensure I had the exact amount of coffee to plus or minus 0.03 inside of the portafilter. But I took the shaker, shake it for 3 seconds, dump it in. And then I would tap it horizontally as I do. And then I had to do this little move, and it's because it's necessary to do this move on the 49, and I'll show you why when we pull that shot, but I'll give it a couple of taps vertically. And then I took a happy tamper with the big foot or the big step, tamp it to full compression, and then we'd lock it and load it, and we'll start it. Now, when I first started this experiment or figuring out how I was going to approach it because the headspace was so different, I started by stacking shower screens or puck screens in here to lessen the headspace, so to displace the amount of water needed or to take away some of the amount of water needed. But then I started to think back on my results with puck screens and how it does affect extraction, figured that wasn't a good way because that will automatically give an advantage to whatever has the shower screens versus what wouldn't. And so I landed on this idea of creating 2 different recipes. Now, as you see during this extraction, we're actually maintaining pressure pretty well here. But what you'll see is the flow rate slowly begins to increase, and you'll see that that doesn't really happen on the 49 millimeter basket. The pressure sort of begins to dip near the end. It does more so with the Kenya coffee, but you can see that that flow rate at the end was slowly increasing more and more. And there we have a 32-second shot. So we'll set this to the side, and then I'll pull one with the 49 millimeter basket.
Yeah.
So now we're gonna do the 49 millimeter. So as you can see inside, there's that awkward step down, which made workflow a bit problematic. Grounds wanted to get caught there, but I only wanted the puck to be that 49 millimeter width. So what I had to do is similar approach. I had this on the Pixie scale. I had it nice and level, shook up the grounds, dump it in. And then what I would do is I would settle horizontally as always. But then, as you can see, when you settle horizontally, it gets caught up on that ridge because I'm dosing 20 grams. So I found if I tapped it in a controlled manner, straight up and down, it would suck those grounds down into the actual puck. So then at the end, if there were grounds left over, I would take a little piece of paper and I would just gently go around those ridges and scrape it right in, so that they were all in. Then if it looked a little uneven on the top, I did have my WDT by my side, and I would do some very gentle surface raking just to ensure as even of a looking puck as possible. Then I took my Streetman tamper, put it in, very tight fit, and I would push with both thumbs as hard as I could every time for consistency's sake. Now we have that loaded. Make sure we're on our 49 millimeter recipe, which we are. There. And we start our shot. So here we go. Flow rate goes really high. As you see, it gets off of the chart for a bit because we went up to like 10 mils a second, and then it goes down and it reaches peak pressure right there at about 10 seconds. So it hits that 9 bar around that 10-second mark. But if you watch the flow rate here, it doesn't really increase. See, the flow rate stays very much constant throughout the rest of the shot. And it's likely because how deep the puck is as opposed to shallow with really readily available solubles. So that flow rate stays constant throughout the entire shot. And right here, bada bing, bada boom, we stop it. So as you see, there was no uptick in that flow and no decrease in pressure at all. And we had a 32-second shot, just like the other one. Now, obviously, doing kind of blind tastes with this was a difficult task because I'd have to pull one, quickly switch out the basket, pull another. Now, even though I pulled 40 shots, I obviously didn't taste all of those because I wasn't alternating every single shot, which would be a very daunting task. It took me about 6 or 7 hours to pull them all anyway, with a I'm very intense in my studio. I keep the dehumidifier at a certain level of humidity in here, so it was at constant 38 RH in here. I kept my air conditioner on to keep it at a constant 22, and so I make sure everything is as clean and perfect as possible, so it takes me quite a while in order to get everything going. But with these shots, it was difficult to do lots of blind tastings. But when I did, I would pull 2 shots, and since they were so big, I'd split it into multiple cups, mix them all up, and taste. And the difference was so obvious and so apparent, even though the extraction yields were about the same, that I could choose every time which one was a better one. They always ended up being the 49 millimeter. So I'm stirring this quite a bit in order to lessen the temperature so that they're a bit closer, but we'll get a taste going on here in a second. So they're both at about 45 degrees centigrade, but let's taste this. 58. On its own, if I did not have this to follow it up, it tastes fantastic. It's very juicy, a lot of acidity, sweet, has a bitterness on the end, a harshness there, a bit of dryiness, but it's a good shot. This one, however, much better structure, no bitter finish, much more juicy. It's overall just a better shot of espresso, better mouthfeel. It's not necessarily thicker, though there is a bit more of a nectar-like body on this, whereas this one is maybe a bit thinner. But they're both really nice shots, but this one is very easy to tell the difference between the two. In fact, we'll have Hugo come up. He doesn't know which is which. Hugo, come taste.
This one is better, and this is a little bit more, how can I say, hollow.
Hollow. Similar descriptors, and that's right, that was 49, this was 58. On paper, you might say, oh, these are the same shots, 20 in, 60 out, same extraction yield, yada, yada, yada. but when you taste them, they're very different. Now, I'd be very curious if I could partner with like Zurich University with Samo Smirke in order to do some gas chromatography on these to see what exactly is being extracted out. But what's the most important thing here is it's very obvious deduction that it's a more even extraction in the deeper puck. Yes, the extractions are the same, but the extraction number means nothing to me other than it tells us some things like at a coarser grind size, we got more extraction out of the 49, meaning it has to be more even if the tastes are like they are. So it's not an objective proof, but it lends to that kind of analysis where it's a higher efficiency of extraction, even though it's a deeper puck, where there might be more stratification. It actually seems to be the opposite, where it's more efficient going through, probably more homogeneous extraction, less heterogeneity, less potential channels forming. Overall, just a more even and more balanced cup and less hollow, better body, things like that. Now, of course, I'm not trying to say that 58 is bad. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. I'm inviting the coffee community to look at this idea of aspect ratio, look at this idea of puck depth, look at this idea of how extraction works, and maybe challenging what we might think or taking for granted or taking tradition at face value. 58 has been long known as the best way of extracting espresso, but it's only based off the fact that all these commercial machines have them. But you'd still have things like the Dalla Corte, which is out there rocking 54 millimeter groups. You have these Los San Marco groups that are 54, and you have people that are swearing by lower and lower diameters. You have people spending almost $3,000 on the Streetman espresso machine, which has a 49 millimeter portafilter. So I think that this is telling us more than anything else that we need to look more seriously at puck depth and at aspect ratio and try to figure out what the best kind of system is. So with a 58 millimeter portafilter, why was that chosen? I can't really say, but I do know that was chosen back when super dark Robusta kind of Fora type coffees were being roasted and were being used, and so extraction efficiency was not really thought of as much. Maybe it was easier and more consistent for them to have these bigger portafilters. Maybe it just fit the machining of the time and it just took hold, but there's never really been a serious attempt at understanding why 58 is kind of the golden choice, the kind of like how 9 bar is just accepted as the golden pressure. And as I did in a recent video on 6 vs 9, it doesn't really seem to affect all that much between those two pressures. Try deeper shots, deeper pucks. Try coarser grounds with those deeper pucks. Instead of doing a more shallow puck that you have to go finer on for puck resistance, rely on depth for the puck resistance, go a bit coarser. That's the thing, is we have all these variables in order to give puck resistance. Puck resistance is necessary for the building of pressure, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to go finer. You can always add coffee in and you can go coarser, kind of like how I used to enjoy pulling shots, which were with much deeper baskets. In fact, to this day, the best espresso I ever had at a cafe was pulled by a guy in Nashville who used it was like a 26 or 27 gram VST with a super lightly roasted Costa Rica Las Lajas. He did a 60 gram output using EK43, and it was really coarse grounds. It was like a 23-second shot or something, and it was mind-blowingly good. The aromatics, the florals, everything. And I'd been chasing that for a long time. I had that shot back in 2017, and I immediately started doing deeper baskets as my way. And I know that another coffee professional, a friend of mine you may know, Luminous Coffee, Mason Salisbury, has also been doing deep baskets for a long time because going coarser with deeper baskets, it just tastes better, but it's more coffee waste. And so for me, in my household, this is why I've been preferring these smaller lever, one of the reasons I've been preferring these smaller lever shots where I'm doing 49, 51, 50, whatever it might be, portafilter heads, and I get that steam pre-infusion, get really nice extractions, descending pressures, and kind of getting no bitterness in sight, and it's like people say, hard to pull a bad shot. For me, I've always said it's been hard to pull a good shot on 58 millimeter flat 9 bars. And so I think this just kind of adds to at least that suggestion that maybe everything we know is not necessarily known for a reason outside of just tradition. After watching this, don't feel bad about having a 58. That's not what I'm trying to say. Don't run out and buy a step-down basket, because I do much prefer a normal 49 millimeter like on the Streetman to the step-down. There's a big difference even there of texture and quality, etc. And the workflow is a bear. Don't run out and buy a different machine because you have a 58. Don't sit there and go, oh, Lance is wrong. I've had 49 versus 58 and 58's better. That's great. Fantastic. I'm glad for you. I'm just trying to, push forth some data that can help us understand what's going on. My goal with this is to understand more and more what we can about espresso extraction and pushing back on conventional understandings that might be based in nothing outside of tradition and just what people kind of stumbled upon. But anyway, I think that is enough for me today. I do want to say that I'm planning a follow-up video. It looks like Weber sells a 28-gram basket, so I'm going to try to get that. It looks to be about 31 millimeters in depth, and in order to get the same aspect ratio of this 49 millimeter portafilter, I'd need a little taller than that, but if I underdose the 49 by a couple of millimeters to about 25 millimeter depth, I can get a 29.5 millimeter depth on the 28-gram basket, which has a 31 millimeter depth overall, and I should be able to have the same depth aspect ratio, and I'm curious if those are going to pull essentially the same shots, because by the law of the transitive property with aspect ratio, I'm curious if it holds true even with all the variables of grinders and whatnot. So that'll be an interesting thing that I'm hoping to do a follow-up video on, running some more tests, doing same aspect ratio, so essentially what that means is same depth to diameter ratio, and seeing how those taste and if the grind sizes are similar, whatever it might be. So I'll take a look at that going forward. But anyway, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Would you try something like this at home, and maybe give your thoughts down below if you have deeper baskets that you don't ever use because you're trying to use less coffee. This is also why I hate single shots. The shallow puck is the worst puck for me. They just don't pull nearly as good of shots. I always get more hollow shots, more bitterness, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, and I guess I should say, because I didn't really say it earlier, there's still an incredible presentation of acidity. You're not lacking acidity on the smaller diameter. So if people want to say, well, I want more acidity, so 58's better, I found in this case that the acidity was just as good, if not a better presentation in the smaller diameter. It was more harsh in the bigger diameter, shallower puck. Anyway, that's enough. All right, done rambling. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this stuff, if you enjoy what I do, please consider hitting like and subscribe, turning on notifications, leaving a comment, saving the link. All that stuff really helps me. I have a second YouTube channel that you can check out down below, as well as a Patreon. But anyway, I want to speed through that because it's like, got to say it. But that's it for today. I hope that you brew something tasty today, and cheers.